Hi, this is Paul Metsa. Welcome to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. Chuck Berry passed away on March 18th, 2017. This show is going to be all about Chuck Berry. Little Steven Van Zandt said this on his website. Chuck Berry was the king of rock and roll, period. Little Richard brought the passion, Elvis Presley the heartbreak, Bo Diddley the beat, Jerry Lee Lewis the abandon, Buddy Holly let the everyman in. Chuck brought the storytelling, the words that Bob Dylan would evolve into an art form. He led the teenage takeover of pop music that the Beatles and Stones would complete. He invented rock and roll guitar and made it look like fun. He gave the previously ignored age group between adolescence and adulthood an identity, a mythology, a chance to see themselves, and he gave them respect. And those teenagers would return that respect to rock and roll for the next 60 years and counting. We have three great guests tonight on the Wall of Power Radio Hour, all of whom are going to add their knowledge and experiences with Chuck Berry to the show. On my far left is Rick Shefchik, a former Pioneer Press reporter and columnist, author of 4 novels and 5 works of nonfiction, including his most recent book, Everybody's Heard About the Bird, The True Story of 1960s Rock and Roll in Minnesota. Next to him, the best-looking drummer in rock and roll, Mr. Bobby Vandell. Bobby has been a mainstay in the Twin Cities music scene for over 4 decades and has played with everyone from Bonnie Raitt, Lamont Cranston, the TC Jammers, Paul Metsa, and had one memorable gig with Chuck Berry. Last but not least, sitting next to me is a true Midwest country legend, Mr. Sherwin Linton. Sherwin has been inaugurated into 11 different Hall of Fames, including the Minnesota Music Hall of Fame, the Minnesota Country Music Hall of Fame, and the South Dakota Citizens Hall of Fame, along both Sitting Bull and Tom Brokaw. He recorded a version of Chuck Berry's Maybelline in 1956 at a radio station. We'll be hearing that later. But let's start with the historian in the group, Mr. Rick Shefchik. Rick, thanks for being here today.
Great to be with you, Paul.
So you're talking to your teenager on your block, and they're going to go, we've been reading about this Chuck Berry, the father of rock and roll, and passed away. How would you describe Chuck Berry to that kid?
If I had to do it verbally, I suppose I would talk about the energy of his records and the poetry of his lyrics. But I think if I had any opportunity at all, I'd just make him listen to the solo on Johnny B. Good, and I'd say, this is rock and roll, and it will always be rock and roll as long as we're all alive. You'll go to a wedding and somebody's going to play this. You'll watch something on television that needs a rock and roll backdrop, and they'll probably be playing Johnny B. Good. He simply created the template for what will forever after be known as rock and roll.
Tell us a little bit about, before we get to our next guest, about how rock and roll came out of early rhythm and blues.
Well, it came out of early rhythm and blues, but if you're looking...
And country music, too.
Well, I was just going to say, country music was also a huge part of it. And as Chuck Berry crafted it, pop music was also part of it. He realized that the twang of country was really important in the guitar sound that he wanted to create. Rhythm and blues very clearly created the structure of the music. It was kind of blues-based, although he got some of that structure from pop music with the verse-chorus. And he put those elements together. But the most important thing that he did was that he aimed it at a market that was emerging and looking for fun, looking for kicks, looking for excitement. And rather than give them trite love songs or maybe sort of roadhouse blues that could get their parents up and dancing and jiving but didn't speak to their interests, he crafted the music for the high school mindset. He wrote about school, he wrote about cars, he wrote about homework.
And getting out of school at the end of the day.
Exactly, about jukeboxes,
Right.
about dancing. He hit the kids where they lived and managed over and over and over again to hit that sweet spot with his songwriting.
Well, the gentleman to my left was a man who really came up in the same era of Chuck Berry, and that's Sherwin Linton. Sherwin, tell us about the first time you heard Chuck Berry.
I was listening to, I grew up in South Dakota, and I actually had a crystal radio set that I'd listen late at night. It was one that you could order a kit for and make and hang the antenna out your window and get a few stations, but the powerful stations, the 50,000 waters, I could hear down south and across the border in Mexico and whatever. And KAAY in Little Rock, Arkansas, played rock and roll and country, and their personalities would say, "This is KAAY, Little Rock, Arkansas," and now you're looking. And so anyway, I'd hear records by Little Richard and of course Big Joe Turner and all these people in rock and roll, and heard Maybelline. And that was in 1955. I went down to the local record store called the Disc Shop in Watertown and asked if they had that record. And he looked it up, and it was on Chess record label. He'd never ordered a Chess record before, but he got it from the distributor or directly from Chess, whatever. And I still have that record, Maybelline, on Chess records.
Wow, is that the original one?
That's the one I got at
How
the time.
cool is that?
And I just love that. I learned it right away. And Chuck Berry and his combo, it says. And on the flip side, he had a song called The Wee Wee Hours, which was a blues kind of song. In the wee wee hours, that's when I think of you. And I learned that too. My friends weren't quite as impressed with that, but I liked it. And I had a pretty eclectic taste in music. So I learned that record, but of course I didn't do it in the style like Chuck Berry. I couldn't have. I didn't know how to play guitar like that. I played a little more rockabilly style, if you will. And I knew what he was playing was a guitar, but I couldn't understand how he could make it sound like that. I didn't realize until sometime later that he was actually playing his ES-335, I think, Gibson, through a very small amp and getting a distortion on his guitar. And man, I just love that sound, but I had no clue how to make the guitar sound like that. But anyway, I did record the song.
Was it like ringing a bell, right? The guitar like ringing a bell.
Exactly. About a year in early '56 somewhere, I worked at the radio station in Watertown, and you could go in there and record a record direct to disc, acetate discs. And so I recorded Maybelline along with several other songs, and with my little band, little group, 3 or 4 people. And then it was by 1956 or 57, he had had several records out then, and School Days came out, and I sat in a place called the Palace of Sweets in Watertown, a soda shop where we'd go after school, and they had homemade candy and hamburgers and all that. And I slugged that jukebox full of about 500 nickels, trying to figure out how they had a bubble-like jukebox.
These weren't wood nickels, were they?
I wish they had. But anyway, really, it seemed like that many times because I was trying to figure out how to play the opening introductory chord to School Days. And I finally figured out, or so I thought I did anyway. And we still do that song.
I want to bring my friend Bobby Vandell into this. 1955 too. What I say in my book, Blue Guitar Highway, I think it was the year America went from black and white to color. You had Maybelline. You also had Rosa Parks, refused to sit in the back of an Alabama bus. You had Allen Ginsberg, Reed Howell for the first time at the Six Gallery in San Francisco. Things were exploding.
The Brooklyn Dodgers beat the Yankees in the World Series.
There you go. Good point, Mr. Shefchik. Bobby, I want to bring you into it here on the first segment, the last part of the first segment on the Wall of Power Radio Hour. Tell us a little bit about, as a drummer, right? Where does the role come into in rock and roll?
As a drummer,
Yeah.
rock and roll got its name, I think, largely because of the drummer. As if you go back and the feel of the music was really established by the drummer. It rocked, it rolled. Of course, rock and roll meant a lot of things. It was a sexual term. It had to do with dancing. It was used early on.
Is that why you got into drumming?
Yeah. Well, that's another program, Paul. I mean, you know, the rock and roll, the drummer owns it.
Right.
You know, Panama Francis said, the drummer drives the bus, everyone else rides.
Yeah.
And so it's got the feel. That's where the feel comes from the drummer.
We are going to have these three gentlemen on for the whole show tonight in the Wall of Power Radio Hour.
Back in the USA, Chuck Berry.
I want you to meet Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. I'm Kieran and I'm Irish, so I tend to like a challenge. Why not? I wanted a whiskey to help find me out what's out there. Like what's really out there. And I found the oldest distillery in Ireland with a water wheel and awards for its small family of whiskies in the middle of Ireland. As I've always seen it, you can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So try it. The investment is small and the flavor is big. It's perfect for drinking neat. Its character holds up, like the Irish, when the bastards try to get you down. Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. Distilled twice for more character, time for more flavor, and less of the old burn. No lite bastardes carborundum. Don't let the bastards get you down.
You're back with the Wall of Power Radio Hour. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. My three guests in the studio to talk about the father of rock and roll, Chuck Berry. Tonight are Rick Shefchik, Bobby Vandell, and Sherwin Linton. Rick's kind of the resident historian here. Tell us a little bit about what was going on the radio back in 1955 and the excitement of finally when fellows like Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and the rest started to hit.
Well, mainstream radio was pop music. I mean, you were getting a lot of Perry Como, Rosemary Clooney, Tony Bennett. You know, all of these are terrific artists, you know, had strengths in their own way, but it was kind of mom and dad's radio. The big bands were on their way out. They weren't drawing as many people to the ballrooms. You know, you can look at Minnesota in particular, and you can see that that was starting to be kind of a losing proposition. And radio, like everybody else, was trying to figure out a way to maybe tap into a new revenue source. And it turns out that the teenagers had the money to spend. So radio finally realized that what you wanted to do was play music that teenage kids would glue themselves to the radio for, not just as background music, but something that they liked so much that they'd call the radio station and say, hey, play that again. I want to hear that again. So you had Elvis Presley coming out of Memphis. He was recording for Sun in 1955, but RCA had their ear to the ground and realized that this is something that they could really promote and make a lot of money out of, so he was on his way. Bill Haley and the Comets had started to bring rock and roll a bit into the mainstream by 1955, but they didn't have a lot of staying power. I mean, they were actually almost a transition from the big band sound. Then, you know, you had a lot of R&B acts, Little Richard be a prime example, that were getting radio play on stations that your mom and dad didn't listen to, and in some cases didn't even know how to find.
Right.
But as Sherwin had said earlier, you know, a lot of kids were starting to listen to radio coming from the South. You know, at night, for instance, when the mainstream pop stations were no longer, you know, playing something that the kids wanted to listen to, they would tune in to these R&B stations who were playing race records, as they called them. In other words, music by black guys. And Chuck Berry, of course, came from St. Louis, and he came along at the right time. He goes up to Chess Records in Chicago, recommended by Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters had met him.
Yeah,
and
let's
said,
not forget about the importance of Muddy's connection there.
right. You know, Chuck had loved Muddy Waters playing and loved blues music, but he was doing something a little bit different. Muddy recognized that, and he suggested that, you know, you should go see Leonard Chess in Chicago. I think he might like your stuff. So he goes up there, and even though Leonard Chess is essentially running a blues label, blues is not going to get played on mainstream radio. Leonard knows that. You know, he's making a decent living off of his blues records, but he's kind of thinking the same way that Sam Phillips did down in Memphis. If I can get one of my guys on pop radio, that's going to change everything. And when Chuck Berry played him his song Ida Red, Leonard heard that and said, you know, I like that. I think if we speed this up a little bit and change the name, we might have a pop hit here. And as it turns out, he didn't like the name Ida Red, but he's looking at a discarded mascara container in the garbage that says Maybelline on it, because that was the name of the manufacturer. Said, let's change the record name to Maybelline.
Right, it was like from the secretary at the studio.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So, and as you said, it's like the world went from black and white to color at that point. Once Chuck Berry started getting radio play, he's kind of made it a little safer for DJs to experiment with records from Sun. Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard starts getting airplay. The Everly Brothers come along, and you know, rock and roll radio was born, and radio has never been the same since.
Sure, when you were a teenager back in that time, you were also playing. What kind of dances and events did you have to really start to hear the rock and roll, dance to it with your friends?
Basically, dances where we had rock and roll, because there wasn't, in Watertown, South Dakota, they didn't have Bill Haley and the Comets coming there, although they did come here to Twin Cities, which I saw them a little bit later. But these rock and roll singers weren't at that immediately coming out to that area. But in the high school, after football and basketball games, we'd have a dance in the gym. And they'd bring in a turntable with a speaker or two and put on records. And that's where, and they were chaperoned, of course, by the teachers. So,
well, guys like you around, of course, they had to be.
yeah, but, oh yeah. Anyway, we were listening to what was on the charts at the time, and unfortunately, Little Richard's records weren't played very much there, because whoever brought the records had, if Little Richard had Tutti Frutti, wop bop a loo bop lop bap boom, Pat Boone had a wop bap a loo bop a lop bop boom, Tutti Frutti, you know. So
It's tough being white, brother.
yeah, and so we'd have his record of it. But nevertheless, when Carl Perkins came out with Blue Suede Shoes, and that was then covered by Elvis too, but and the Chuck Berry songs, and later on Buddy Holly, and so many of these people that were all coming out at the same time, that was the music that we were listening to at the high school dances, and listening to it on a record player, most of it.
Let's go over to Bobby Vandell, who's younger than you, not by much.
Not by much.
When did you get hip to Chuck Berry for the first time, Bobby?
Well, as a kid, of course, like these guys have said, listening to the radio, listening to, I think that KAY Little Rock, you talked about that. I think that show was called Beaker Street.
Yeah.
That's what it was called. And I listened to that same station in WLS out of Chicago, and back then, you know, we didn't have the categories of music, so you could hear James Brown and the Everly Brothers in the same set. You know, they're jumping all over the place musically, which was so that it was back when I was a kid, when I was a young boy, probably 4 or 5 years old.
You're in tune with the Wall of Power Radio Hour. Rick Shefchik, Bobby Vandell, Sherman Linton, I'm Paul Metsa. We're going to go out with a little Chuck Berry music and then come back for the rest of the night and talk about the father of rock and roll, Chuck Berry.
Long distance information to give me Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you. Help me find the party trying to get in touch with me. She could not leave her number, but I know who placed the call. My uncle took the message and he wrote it on the wall.
If you've got gear, you need a case, and why not use the best? Alcorn Custom Case was started by Billy Alcorn, who's been in the music business for 30 years, and his small family business, located in the heart of Nashville, has been satisfying customers since 2006. Here are a few of Alcorn Custom Case's famous clients. When you're on the road, your gear has to get there in one piece. Stop in on Billy at Alcorn Custom Case and have a specially made case designed just for you. Alcorn Custom Case can be found on the web at alcorncustomcase.com, or stop in at 3215 Ambrose Avenue in Nashville, or just give Billy a call at 615-678-6259. Alcorn Custom Case. Don't trust your gear with anyone else. What can you do with so much space? The Solar Arts Building in Northeast Minneapolis. A masterpiece of exposed brick, wooden beams, hardwood floors, and natural light, this unique multi-use space is perfect for a variety of events. To literally top it off, there are over 100 solar panels on the roof, making the Solar Arts Building self-sustainable. You've got the need, we've got the space. The Solar Arts Building, 711 Northeast 15th Avenue in beautiful Northeast Minneapolis. Give them a call at 763-234-5069 or send a message to mike@solarartsbuilding.com.
Welcome back to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. We're celebrating the life and times of the father of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, tonight. Rick, tell us a little bit about rock and roll in the movies.
Well, that kind of started the same time that rock and roll hit the radio. Alan Freed, I think, had a lot to do with getting rock and roll into movies. The names of the films of the later 50s are kind of forgettable. There was one called Go Johnny Go that Chuck Berry appeared in. He did 3 movies, but they were all just, you know, kind of rock and roll exploitation films with no plot, and they'd bring maybe 7 to 10 acts to come in and do their hit. It hung together only because kids wanted to see these groups and they didn't care what the movie was about as such. It really wasn't until A Hard Day's Night in 1964 that there was any actual coherence or point, really, to a rock and roll film. But, Chuck Berry was always a really canny entertainer. And if it was making a pop culture reference in a lyric, or figuring out that he needed to change Colored Boy to Country Boy and Johnny Be Good to hit a wider audience, or if it meant promoting his music in the movies, which was kind of a new thing for teenagers to be looking for, but you know, he was not going to miss a trick when it came to using whatever cultural means were at his disposal to become a more popular artist.
Well, you're a writer, Rick Shefchik. Tell us a little bit about some of your favorite Chuck Berry lines, because Bob Dylan called him the Shakespeare of rock and roll.
Well, Sweet Little 16 is probably my favorite Chuck Berry song, and I love the line about you know, how, well, all the excitement's over. She's played mom against dad to get to see this rock and roll show, but then you know, it's what happens afterwards that I love. Sweet Little 16, she's got the grown-up blues. She's wearing tight dresses and lipstick. She's sporting high heel shoes. But then tomorrow morning, she'll have to change her trend. Sweet Little 16, back in class again.
Huh.
I just think that's beautiful stuff. You know, it flows off the tongue, and it also kind of gets to the, you know, there's a little edge of smuttiness to some of Chuck's songs, and that didn't hurt him at all.
And he was 30 years old when he was writing this stuff.
Yes, he was.
You know?
And writing about 16-year-old girls.
Yeah. So Sherwin, when was the first time you saw Chuck Berry perform?
1958
Really? And where was that?
at the Minneapolis Auditorium.
Wow.
On Alan Freed's Big Beat Rock and Roll Show.
And I think we brought a copy of that poster.
Yes. The day of the show, Screamin' Jay Hawkins was the opening act.
Wow.
I put a spell on you. And then he did his other flip side of that called Little Demon. And all these other acts on there, the Diamonds and Joanne Camel and all these other people. And then came on Buddy Holly and the Crickets.
Wow.
And then Chuck Berry, and the closing act was Jerry Lee Lewis. And I saw Chuck Berry do that duck walk. Immediately I started trying to imitate him, you know, and do a similar thing, and jump all over the place and scooting around with my guitar, throwing it up in the air and so forth. So that was my first experience of seeing Chuck Berry. We were talking about rock and roll movies. In 1955, me and a friend went to a performance of Blackboard Jungle, and that was my first experience with really seeing and hearing rock and roll in a movie. The artist that was performing it was not on screen, but it was Bill Haley and the Comets during the opening credits doing Rock Around the Clock, and we both looked at each other and said, "Listen to that music!"